Hey, what's up with it, guys? Hey, welcome back to another video. This one, the most votes on the Moon King's Discord. So we are doing the Moonkin Masterclass. This is the third version of this series, or the third episode, I guess you could say. And we are breaking down the damage of Moonfire and Insect Swarm and trying to figure out if it is worth the global cooldown. So without any further ado, let's get into it. So we have here, let's go ahead and pull up our Excel. We have here the breakdown that I did. It's the same spreadsheet that we used before, so don't get overwhelmed by the numbers. All the stuff here at the top, with the exception of these couple little tables here, are the same as they were before when we did the comparison between Wrath and Starfire. The only stuff that's new is this stuff down here below, and I'll break that down, but it's basically doing the same thing we did here to break down the spell power coefficients and the base damage and get a real accurate representation of the actual DPS of each ability. So we also moved over the mana efficiency stuff. We don't need to show you, but just so you guys know exactly what spreadsheet we're using and so you guys know where everything is. This is the same stuff as before. I just bumped it all over so that for simplicity's sake to go through this, we're only looking at this relevant stuff. Now, I need to preface this with a couple things. First is that we are not accounting for outside variables, things like Curse of Shadows, world buffs, flasks, all that kind of stuff. So keep that in mind. In this comparison, we're talking mostly about Moonfire and Starfire, so something like Curse of Shadows is going to affect both of them the same, so it won't affect any of these numbers as far as comparison's sake, but just be aware that it will affect things comparing like Moonfire versus Insect Swarm if you have Curse of Shadows versus not, right? Because Insect Swarm is not going to be benefiting from that as its nature damage. One other thing just to touch on is that the only variables that should be changed on this template at all, again, I will post this down. You guys can always download this and plug in these numbers and mess with this spreadsheet yourself. But these blue cells up here at the top are the only ones that we have any input that should go. The rest of these are all formulas, and it will auto-populate all of this information, and you can always click any of these cells and see what it is at the top. I'm not sure how familiar you guys are with Excel and things like that, but just so you guys know how it works. The last but not least thing is that we need to keep in mind the ranks of these abilities. At the time of recording this, this is phase 4. What this means is that we do not have rank 7 of Starfire yet. We are using rank 10 of Moonfire for our comparison and rank 5 of Insect Swarm. I thought about potentially trying to do some comparison with downranking Moonfire and Insect Swarm, but I couldn't think of a scenario where it really would make sense, because in those situations I don't think it would be worth the buff slot. I don't know. If you guys can think of a reason of why it would ever make sense to downrank, and maybe there's a scenario I'm just not thinking of outside of like PvP and baiting out a Nature Grace proc. I don't know that there's ever a scenario in PvE situations that you would want to be downranking Moonfire, but again, maybe if you guys can think of a reason why you would, let me know down in the comments below, and you know, we can do some kind of comparison on that as well. Now, a couple things that are important to note here is that Moonkin has an initial burst damage that has its own coefficient, and Moonfire, the damage over time, has its own coefficient. They're two separate coefficients. Now, for those of you guys that don't know, and I talked about this before, but the coefficient is basically what percentage of your bonus spell power actually contributes to the spell. Starfire is one of the few spells in the game that has 100% spell power coefficient, meaning if you have 500 spell power, Starfire is going to do 500 more damage every time you cast it and it lands. Moonfire and Insect Swarm do not have as high of a coefficient. Now, Moonfire's initial burst has just under a 15% spell power coefficient. The damage over time does roughly 13% of your bonus spell power with each damage over time tick. And there's 4 ticks in total with Moonfire, so that brings it up to a total of 52% bonus spell power coefficient on the damage over time component. We add these two together, that gives us just over a 67% spell power coefficient. That's on the entirety of the cast. Now you have to keep in mind when we're comparing damage over time effects versus the actual burst damage of something like Starfire, you have to assume that the entire damage over time effect is actually going to play out. So if you have 12 seconds of the dot that are going to happen with the Moonfire ticks, if the fight ends in 5 seconds, you're not gaining from that last, 7 seconds of the damage over time component. So that's obviously going to skew the numbers. So for sake of comparing these numbers, I am assuming that Moonfire is going to play out its full duration of the damage over time component. So in a shorter fight, obviously Moonfire is going to be less valuable, assuming that it can't actually tick all the way through. So keep that in mind. For comparing the numbers, we're assuming that you cast a Moonfire, it's going to basically go through its full duration of that cast. Now we have the cast speed, the mana, the base damage, which is basically just the damage added up from the tooltip itself in game, the bonus damage, which is the spell power coefficient, times our plugged in number here. So you can see if I change this, that all of these numbers all change. I have 383 because this is what I have currently in my PvE raid gear with all of our spell hit stuff on. Then we have our total damage, which is the summation of the bonus damage plus the base damage. And then we have damage per mana, which is just a mana efficiency thing. Mostly what I'm concerned about is trying to figure out overall output rather than mana efficiency. And then we have DPS, which basically breaks down the total damage divided by the cast speed. Now you might say, well, why do you have a cast speed of 1.5 seconds? It's an instant cast spell. That is true, however, it does trigger the global cooldown. So for comparison's sake, you need to calculate in a 1.5 second cast speed. While you obviously can cast this on the run, you can do it while moving, it does take 1.5 seconds after casting this spell to be able to cast your next spell. So for all intensive purposes, it has a cast speed of 1.5 seconds, at least from a numbers comparison standpoint. Now, we have the same thing down here. This kind of middle table is basically just a more detailed version of how we got to these numbers. So it's not really relevant. If you guys want to look at this, you can, but basically it's just doing these in individual cells rather than just submitting it all in one box. Now, one thing to mention is this little box right here above the total over the damage over time portion is the amount that Moonfire should tick for. So you can kind of mess with this. I did mess with this out in open world and I plugged in different numbers based off my gear, and it's spot on. I mean, like I was doing this and it's 164.87 damage. Moonfire was ticking for 165 damage. It was right. The numbers on this are all right based on my gear. So again, plug in your numbers if you guys want to play with this and put gear on, plug in your own stats, and then go out in the open world and see if all of these numbers are accurate. But for me, when I was testing this, this is all accurate. Now, down to Insect Swarm, we have the same thing with the cast speed, the mana, base damage. Insect Swarm has a different coefficient. So Insect Swarm benefits roughly the same. It's around 13% bonus spell power per tick. However, Insect Swarm ticks every 2 seconds rather than every 3 like Moonfire. So you actually get a total of 6 ticks of Insect Swarm over the duration at 13 some odd percent or 12.66%. And so that's where you get this just under 76% spell power coefficient. Now at surface value, let's step back for a second and get a little bit less mathy, okay? Moonfire has a total of 67% spell power coefficient. Insect Swarm has just under 76. Insect Swarm is higher. So what this means is as we're going to get more and more spell damage, Moonfire is going to benefit less and less in comparison or relative to Insect Swarm. So as you get better and better gear, Insect Swarm is going to start pulling ahead eventually, in a sense. It's not going to be doing more damage than Moonfire per se, but it's going to be scaling farther. So it's going to be bridging the gap between the two. One thing that is really interesting that I didn't realize how significant this was is Insect Swarm is incredibly mana efficient. I always knew it was mana efficient. I didn't know it was this mana efficient. It is by far our most mana efficient spell. Almost 50% more mana efficient than Moonfire when it comes to overall damage output. And again, since this scales with our bonus spell power, it is going to keep scaling higher and higher as far as the efficiency go. If we get up to 600 or 700 spell power, it's insanely efficient for the actual damage output. So that's something to keep in mind. I don't know how relevant that's going to be in a lot of raiding environments, as the likelihood you have 2 debuff slots is going to be very, very slim. But there are going to be times out in open world stuff where mana efficiency is important in given situations, and just know that Insect Swarm is by far our highest damage per mana of any spell. Now, on to the comparisons. So what we did here is we have all of our Moonkin numbers, and what I did is I took the Moonkin overall DPS versus the Starfire DPS. Now keep in mind, all of these numbers of what I have highlighted, the whole bottom section of this does not have bonus damage calculated in for crit. When I was comparing Wrath and Starfire, that wasn't really relevant because both of them could crit the same and both of them are going to crit for twice as much, right? But I had to figure out how to do that on this comparison because Moonfire's damage over time cannot crit. The initial burst can crit, and if you're talented, which you should be for it, it has a 10% increased chance to crit over Starfire with the improved Moonfire talent. So that was kind of a confusing thing to have to figure out how to do, but we ended up doing that up here in this table up at the top, and I'm going to go through that here in just a second. But I want you guys to know that in this bottom portion, in this specific table right here that I have highlighted, this Moonfire versus Starfire, is comparing the overall raw damage in combination with the spell power coefficients and in combination with our bonus spell power. It is not factoring in crit. So at surface value, as far as just the overall, assuming none of your spells are going to crit, Moonfire at these breaking points, ignore the crit again, the crit's not calculated in here, but at 383 spell power, Moonfire is dealing 200% Starfire, so it's exactly double. So what this is translating into is that Moonfire, assuming that the entire duration of the dot is going to go off, is basically a guaranteed Starfire crit when it comes to actual damage output. 200%, it's dealing twice as much as a non-crit Starfire, so it is, for all intents and purposes, is a Starfire crit. Now, if we go up in and we start to calculate in the crit percentages, this gets actually really interesting. So up here in the top chart, what we did is I took the total damage of the spell. So Starfire, for example, is 920, and then we multiplied, basically it has a 30% chance to do double damage, and it has a 70% chance to do 100% damage, just normal damage. Then you average those together. So the only way to do this effectively is to average them together. So again, the only way you would actually have these numbers play out in game to actually compare this realistically is you have to have 100 casts, basically, right? Because it's percentage based. So the only way to actually realize 30% is to have enough casts to actually have that quantity be available. So keep that in mind. There is some RNG if you're banking on, you have, world buffs, and the likelihood you're going to crit is higher, and you're just going to go ahead and just try and get the crits, and hopefully you get lucky with 4 or 5 crits in a row. That's fine, but I had to average this out over the entire percentage, which would be 100 casts, would be how you would actually be able to test this in real, in-game experience. Now, we did the same thing with Moonfire. However, we have, like I said, improved crit because of our talents. Not to mention, the only thing that's going to benefit from the actual crit is the initial burst damage, which for me in this gear is around 311 damage. So that means there's a chance I crit and it does about 600 damage. So trust me, this formula basically says that. This is a little bit confusing, but what I had to basically do is that there's like a 40% chance this is going to deal double damage. There's a 60% chance, right? Because you can't have over 100% chance for something to happen. So we reduce this by the variance. This has a 60% chance to deal 100% damage only when it comes to the initial burst. Then we added in the damage over time component on top of that. That's how you get this total damage. So you'll see that this total damage is slightly more than the actual 970 that we have baseline, because it's factoring in a 40% chance with these numbers, a 40% chance for the initial burst to deal twice as much damage, bringing the average damage of this ability when we have 30% crit at just under 1100 damage every time we cast it. Now, the biggest thing to note here is while the average damage is pretty close and Starfire pulls ahead slightly, you also have to keep in mind that Moonfire is an instant cast, which is a 1.5 second, cast speed as far as the global cooldown is concerned, as opposed to 3 seconds. So it's dealing almost twice as much damage. As we get more and more spell power, this variance starts to spread in the favor of Starfire. And when we get the next rank of Starfire, this is also going to continue because Starfire scales more. It has a higher spell power coefficient. However, if you have worse gear, or say you're stacking a lot of hit and you're losing spell power at the expense of that hit, Moonfire still ends up having a ton of value because the base damage of the spell is so high. So what this is saying here is that Starfire is dealing 58% of the DPS that Moonfire is dealing. That's what this 58% is, just a dividing these two against each other to see what the percentage is between them. TLDR, if you can use the mana and you don't have mana issues on a fight is lasting shorter, and you have that debuff slot, you more consistently will gain DPS from being able to cast Moonfire if you're able to upkeep that dot. Now, the thing that's going to be really interesting and I'm going to start testing out is how do we combine this with things like Toep or Zandalari Hero Charm, because while Moonfire is benefiting less from the actual bonus spell power, it's going to be more consistent and more reliable because it's guaranteed damage, right? So Starfire will deal more damage assuming it crits, but if you get no crits over that duration of those trinkets, I don't know if it's worth it. So what I think I'm going to be doing here moving forward is with Toep, because Toep is a 15-second duration. What we can do is we can Toep Moonfire at the start, Starfire our way through the Toep bonus, then at the very end we can snapshot one more Moonfire. So we basically can get 2 Moonfires off, benefiting from the full value of Toep, basically giving us DPS output wise the value of 2 guaranteed Starfire crits with Toep. Hopefully you guys can follow that. That's what I'm thinking in my head. I think with Zandalari Hero Charm, it's not really going to work the same way since you get diminished bonus spell power each cast. So you want to basically have as many long casts in that as possible so that you're gaining the most from the spell power. But something like Toep, for example, Toep into Moonfire, Starfire, 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 Moonfire again right before Toep ends, then pop Zandalari Hero Charm, and then spam Starfire. I think that's actually going to be our best bet. Again, this can kind of change and you can kind of try and play on the RNG if you're fully world buff and you have high crit, but again, it's going to be RNG. Sometimes it will do better, but sometimes you're going to be performing worse just because you're not getting lucky crits. Not to mention, if you're not hit capped right, you have resists to take into consideration as well. Now, to kind of show you guys the last bit of this point of what I'm trying to make is, say we have 383 is the bonus spell power we're using in this example. If I bump this up, say I bump this up to 600, you can see here, this is kind of to the point of what I was saying. Moonfire is only dealing 186% chance, sorry, 186% of the damage of Starfire as opposed to 200% like it was earlier. So as we go up, if say we could get to 1,000 spell power, oops, that's 100. 1,000 spell power, it drops down even more. Right now it's only 171. But the way you kind of have to think of this, or the way at least I'm going to be thinking about this, is that if I don't have a 70% chance to crit, Moonfire is my more surefire way of actually dealing more damage. There are chances I can get lucky RNG and Starfire can crit, where in those situations Starfire will be doing better, but Moonfire is consistently basically dealing the same as if Starfire were to crit but have a 70% bonus damage instead of 100% bonus damage, right? So you just have to think of it, there's consistency, there's RNG, you have to kind of pick and determine what you actually want and what the situation allows for. But the last thing I wanted to point out, in the same vein, if we have less spell power, if you're just starting out as a newer balanced druid and you're still here 17 minutes into this video, as you have worse gear, as you have lower spell power, Moonfire is your friend. While it is mana intensive because the base damage is so high, basically Moonfire in this situation, if we have only 100 bonus spell power, or say you're actually in full healing gear or you're doing PvP or something like that, Moonfire is dealing the same as 1.3 crits, right? It'd be the equivalent if you had a talent that Starfire is going to crit for 130% bonus damage. That's how much damage Moonfire is doing every time, which is pretty insane when you really think of it. So really take into consideration and value the fact that the base damage of Moonfire is so high. Use it for consistency on fights, use it for those shorter fights. Let's test it out and run it with Toep, things like that, and see what we can do as far as overall DPS output. Hopefully you guys are able to get a debuff slot to really test this out. That's kind of a big variable when it comes to the raid environment. Things like ZG shouldn't matter, AQ20 it shouldn't matter, right? 20-man raids, the debuff slot's not nearly as contested. But you know, we'll see. We have a couple warlocks that have stopped raiding with us, so we have a couple more debuff slots. So I'm going to be trying to mess with this here come BWL and come MC, do what we can to not run out of mana and see if we can actually get some higher parses and some higher DPS numbers while keeping Moonfire up some of the time. I don't think it's something you're going to want to have up 100% of the time, but it is. Oh, and I almost forgot. Okay, this is one other really important factor. A huge part of the value of Moonfire as well that you cannot quantify easily in this spreadsheet is that because it has this increased chance to crit, it has the same increased chance to give you a Nature Grace proc, and since it's obviously instant cast, it will not consume Nature's Grace. So you actually gain value, because if you can bait out those crits and have a higher chance of ensuring that your next Starfire is in fact going to have Nature's Grace, that's huge. That's absolutely huge, and there's a huge amount of DPS to be gained from that. So that's another reason why something like using Moonfire at the beginning of TOEP, having a higher chance of then getting the Nature's Grace proc in your first TOEP, to then, you know, more realistically be able to fit all of those spells into that cast, is really big. Hopefully that makes sense to you guys. I'm going to be messing around with an opener that's Wrath into Moonfire to bait out hopefully almost a guaranteed Nature's Grace proc, then opening into Starfire to really maximize our DPS, and then, like I said, using Moonfire in those situations with TOEP or things like that, or snapshotting it to really maximize our damage. So again, guys, hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully you guys learned something from this. Let me know down below if you guys have questions, or if there's something I did not elaborate on well enough, or hop by. We've been streaming Tuesday, Thursday, Sundays. Come hang out, ask questions. It's a really good way for me to communicate with you guys or answer your questions in a more long form discussion. Also, last but not least, Moonking's Discord link down below. That's been a really cool little project as well. Really good little community developing over there. So come hang out. Thank you guys for hanging out for 21 minutes. I really do appreciate it. And with that said, I'll catch you guys in the next one. See ya.